Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're here with another video to help you improve your chess game. Today I'd like to talk about a subject I call Not All Bads Are Equal. And I'll start out by telling you a little story. I was once going over a game with a student, and his opponent made a capture, and he had two ways to recapture. One way lost a pawn, and the other way didn't. But it did happen to isolate a pawn, even though he wouldn't lose any material. So after his opponent made the capture, I didn't look at the score sheet. I just said, okay, well, now you have to recapture this way. And my student says, oh, I didn't do that. And I'm like, well, you have to, because you have to recapture, and you only have two recaptures, and this one doesn't lose material, and if you play it the other way, then you lose a pawn. And my student said, yes, but if I take it the way that you say, that would isolate my pawn, and I didn't want to isolate a pawn, so I took it the other way. And I said, yes, but that loses a pawn. And he says, well, yeah, I know, but I didn't want to isolate the pawn. So what happened there is he valued the isolation of his pawn as worse than losing a pawn, which of course doesn't make any sense, because not having a pawn gives you no value at all, and isolating a pawn takes away a very small percentage of its value. So if you have a choice between losing a pawn and isolating a pawn, unless there's something weird going on, which, occasionally happens in chess, but, 99% of the time, having an isolated pawn is going to be a lot better than having no pawn at all. So he didn't know a value for an isolated pawn. He just knew it was bad, and he wanted to avoid bad, so he didn't do it. And this is the problem. For instance, suppose you have a choice between losing a queen for a pawn or losing a knight for a pawn. For instance, suppose your queen and your knight get forked by a pawn, and you have to decide which one to save. Well, you have values for that. If you use the Reinfeld values, knights are worth 3, queens are worth 9, and pawns are worth 1. Well, okay, so you'd rather lose 3 for 1 and lose 2 pawn equivalent than lose 9 for 1 and lose an 8 pawn equivalent. So you say, oh, I know those numbers. I'd rather lose 3 for 1 than lose 9 for 1, so therefore the numbers are going to tell me which one is less bad. But in chess, there's lots of things that you learn that are, quote, bad, that don't have values. Like when we talked about that isolated pawn. If you're writing a program for isolated pawns, and you're a chess program, and you have to give it a value, it's going to vary, but if you had to give it a fixed value, it might be something like, take away, 0.1 value or 0.15 or something really small like that if the pawn is isolated. It wouldn't be take away 1.5, where it's better to lose a pawn than it is to have the pawn isolated. So you have these not all bads are equal kind of thing. And a lot of people read these strategy books, and they're not the people that are reading them aren't very advanced, but they don't know that what they're reading is too sophisticated for them. And they read that Grandmaster so-and-so lost this game because his pawns got doubled, and his opponent took advantage of that, and they ended up losing the game. And they go, oh my goodness, double pawns are bad. I have to avoid double pawns. And then they tend to think that this is a terrible thing that might happen to them, that they might get double pawns. And they do all kinds of crazy things in the game to avoid getting double pawns, when in fact, in most cases, the double pawns aren't that bad at all. But they don't know that. They just hear that double pawns are bad, and they try to avoid it at all costs, as if it's going to cost them the game whenever that happens. And of course, that's not true. But they don't know that. They just assign it as a bad thing, and they try to avoid it wherever possible. So that's why I call this video Not All Bads Are Equal, because like, for instance, double pawns can sometimes be good. There's some situations where double pawns are actually helpful. So you can't just say double pawns are really bad, I always have to avoid them. Well, in most cases, double pawns are a negative, but not in all cases. And of course, not all things that are bad are equally bad. So for instance, suppose you're ahead in a game, and you're ahead in material, and you decided not to follow the principle, when you're ahead in material, try to make fair trades of pieces, but not necessarily pawns. And instead of doing that, you decide not to trade off. Well, then it's going to be pretty hard to win the game if you don't trade off any pieces, because The only way you're going to win without winning by attrition is to try to mate him. And yes, if you have more material, you might be able to mate him. But it's a lot easier to trade everything off, get into an endgame where you're ahead, maybe promote a pawn, and checkmate him that way. You win by attrition. But if you refuse to win by attrition, it's going to be pretty tough. So one bad would be not making trades when you're ahead, not making fair trades. If you have if you're up a knight and you have a chance to trade queens, which is the example I'm going to give on the board here in a second, then if you don't do that, then that's really bad. You know, you could do that and just win the game instantly. Just as bad, if not worse, would be the corollary, which is when you're losing, you want to avoid trading pieces. You don't want fair trades of pieces because it makes it easier for your opponent. Now, there's some, times when that's not true. Yes, like for instance, if you could trade into a bishop opposite color endgame when you're down a pawn, then you're probably making the right kind of trade, and you're down a pawn in a bishop opposite color endgame. Very often you can get a draw. But that's the exception rather than the rule. Normally, if you trade down, especially if you trade into a king and pawn endgame, king and pawn endgames are trivially easy to win when you're up in material usually. So if you're losing, you don't want to trade into a king and pawn endgame unless you're absolutely certain that you're not going to lose. So again, not all bads are equal. Usually, it's a lot worse to trade pieces when you're losing than it is to get a double pawn. In fact, it's probably like 100 to 1 worse. But, that's the kind of thing you don't read. You just read double pawns are bad, trading when you're losing is bad. But nobody says, well, trading when you're losing, that's generally disastrous. But if you get double pawns, very often that has not much effect on the game. Maybe a small effect. Okay, so let's look at this position. Let's say it's black's move. Let's click the button and make it black's move. All right, and black is ahead of knight. Well, if we're ahead of knight and we could force a trade of queens, that would be wonderful. But here, if black is going to trade queens, he has to play queen h6. Well, what does that do? If white then takes on h6, it's going to mess up black's pawn structure. So queen h6, queen takes h6, g takes h6. Black has doubled isolated pawns on a rook file. That's pretty weak. He has an isolated pawn on the f file, and before this trade, none of those pawns were bad. So when black did this, was this a really bad move? Well, let's ask Stockfish here. Let me raise the... I'm going to change the screen here for a second so you can see the engine. All right, Mr. Stockfish, what's the evaluation now? Stockfish says black is ahead by over 6 pawns. So the fact that those pawns are isolated and they're all messed up, it means almost nothing. Black's up a knight. He traded queens, got the most dangerous white piece off the board, and it's a trivial win in the endgame. The fact that black's pawns are all messed up is fairly small. So we can see here that black trading off queens was the important thing. Trading when he was winning was the good thing, and if he hadn't traded, well, he would still be winning, of course, but that would be, quote, bad. He wants to trade when he's winning, and of course he's winning rather trivially easy here after the trade of queens. Now, if we change the position, all right, so of course the engine isn't going to want to trade the queens. He's just going to want to guard the back rank mate and win anyway, because the engine doesn't care about trading when he's winning. Engines don't worry about complications and things like that. They just look for the highest number and go for it. All right, so let's change the position now, and let's give white a knight so that the material is now even. Let's put a knight on g1. All right, and let's make it black's move again. Okay, and let's ask for the evaluation of the position here with black to play. And Stockfish says black is ahead by about almost a pawn, minus 0.9. And it says black should play knight d6. And why is black better? Well, now we do have that isolated pawn that is easily attacked. It's easily attacked by a knight and a queen, and it's not so easily guarded by the knight. So that's a problem for white. In fact, we could actually put that pawn on a better square. Let's move it back a square. Let's put the pawn over here. See if that makes... We just want to make sure on the queen checks wins this pawn because the queen would have to go in the way. So we need to We need to move the knight somewhere where he's not losing it. Let's put the knight over here. All right. Make it black's move again. All right, Mr. Stockfish. What's the evaluation here? Well, black's still better with knight d6, the same move, even though now white's not losing a pawn right away. Black's ahead by about 6/10 of a pawn. All right, let's go back to that other position where the queens can be traded now, where it was about -1. I think it was this position. All right, so here it was about -1. Let's see what happens if black trades the queens here. Because black's not winning, he shouldn't mess up his pawns here for nothing. Queen h6. What a terrible move. Queen takes h6, g takes h6, and black went from being ahead 1 pawn to being down 1.2. So messing up all 3 pawns here gave black the equivalent. He was on the verge of having a winning position, and now he's just about having a losing position just for doing that. So we can see those bads don't at all have the same value. When the knight was not on the board, then moving the queen to h6, even though it's not the best move, was a perfectly good move and left black with a very, very easy win. With the material even, that move would be crazy, just destroying your pawn structure. So you can't give those things the same values. And again, we're trading off 2 different kinds of things that don't have numbers. One is, should you trade when you're winning, or should you avoid trades when you're losing? And, should you mess up your pawns or not? Well, obviously messing up your pawns in general is bad, but trading queens when you're winning is good, and you have to balance those things. So let's take a look at some other things. Like, for instance, let's say you accept double pawns in the Roy Lopez. All right, let's make the board back to normal size here. All right, so knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, a6, and white says, oh, I can double black's pawns. Bishop takes, pawn takes. All right, well, is this really bad for black? Well, let's look at the evaluation again. We'll bring the engine back up. If white had played bishop a4, Stockfish 14 has him as a Roy Lopez advantage of about, looks a little high to me. It says 0.5, but let's say 0.4. Now it's down to 0.3. That makes more sense. So bishop a4, and with an advantage of, let's say, about 0.4 for the Roy Lopez. But if you play bishop takes knight and double his pawns, your advantage drops all the way down to about 0.1. Now it's almost at 0. Pawn takes. If you're not familiar with this, white cannot win this pawn. Knight takes e5 because of queen d4 with a double attack on the pawn and the knight. And now if the knight comes back, queen to e4, queen takes, king takes. And black's already better. Why is black better when he has the doubled pawns? Is it because white can't castle? And the answer is nope. Now again, this is back to our subject matter. When you can't castle, that can be a disaster. And here white can't castle and black can, and that could make all the difference in the game. But in this particular position, it makes no difference at all. White can simply play rook e1 and then tuck his king away, and there's nothing black can really do to prevent that. In fact, you can see black's best move here, according to the engine, is f6. And if white wants to play rook e1, it says black should play knight e7, and it says black here is ahead by 0.7, 0.9. Tremendous advantage. But he's the one with the double pawns, and white's the one who can't castle. But double pawns are supposed to be bad, and not castling's supposed to be bad. Well, shouldn't they kind of neutralize and say black has the double pawns and white can't castle, it should be about even? And the answer is no, because not only none of those beds are equal, not castling in this case is not a big deal, it's because black has the bishop pair. The bishop pair isn't when you have 2 bishops. The bishop pair is when you have 2 bishops and your opponent does not. It's really short for the advantage of the bishop pair. Well, here black has the advantage of the bishop pair for the endgame, and even though white can safely play king f1 anytime he wants here, that bishop pair is going to be a big deal in the endgame. So here not all bads are equal, and again, black has the advantage because of the bishop pair. The double pawns don't mean that much. The fact that white can't castle doesn't mean that much here. Let's look at this pawn structure again. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, a6, bishop takes, pawn takes. If white should get into an endgame here, let's say he plays the line that Lasker played against Capablanca with d4, and they end up trading queens. Well, now black still has the bishop pair, and you can see black has a slight advantage, but at least here the double pawns are a little bit weaker than they were in the last line that we looked at, because those 4 pawns against 3, that majority cannot create a passed pawn in the endgame, while white's 4 on 3 can create a majority in the endgame. So here the double pawns are at least a little bit weaker, not enough to make up for the bishop pair. And again, these things don't all have values. The bishop pair is roughly worth about a half a pawn, but we don't know how much we should take away for that crippled majority. But obviously the crippled majority, according to Stockfish, is not worth nearly as much in the negative sense as the positive value of having the bishop pair, because he likes black by about minus 0.3, minus 0.4, and the bishop pair is worth a half, so he's giving the double pawns maybe a minus a tenth or so, even though white is a little ahead in development here. So this is a case where white can create a passed pawn and black can't, so the double pawns are a little bit bad here. Now let's do something interesting. Right now it says minus 0.31. Let's change the double pawn from c6 to f6. Let's see, right now it's black's move, so we'll make it black's move again. We'll put the pawn on f6, and now we'll make it black's move. All right, Mr. Stockfish, how's this? All right, now as you can see, the number's a little higher. Before it was like 0.4, and right now it's hanging in 0.6, 0.7. So why did we help black by making double pawns on the f file instead of the c file? And the answer is that now neither side has a majority. White has 3 on 3 on the queen side, and black, 3 on 3, both sides have 3 on 3. Both sides have 4 on 4 on the king side, but that's where black's double pawns are. But those double pawns are enough to prevent white from getting a passed pawn in the endgame. So it's better for black if he has the double pawns on f6 than the double pawns on c6, because on c6, black would have a crippled queenside majority and white would have a healthy kingside majority. And here black would have nobody has a majority on either side, and black's double pawns are able to hold off white's pawns. So it's not as bad to have the double pawn here. So again, the theme for this video is not all bads are equal, and here we're comparing 2 double pawns and they're not even equal, even though everything else on the board is pretty much the same. So again, you have to be careful about that. So let's look at a different position where you can't castle. Let's go to, we'll leave Stockfish running so you can, let's create some sort of trap here. Knight f3, d6, bishop here, bishop g4. Let's get a position where we can play bishop f7. So let's trying to get the queen out of the equation. All right, let's play d3 and a6. All right, can we play? We still can't play bishop f7 because after king takes knight g5 check, he has queen takes g5. So I'd have to block that. Maybe I can play maybe instead of a6 I can play knight e7. There we go. All right, now bishop takes f7 is on. So bishop takes f7 check, king takes, knight checks. If the king attacked, well, the king can't attack the knight because the knight's going to be guarded by the queen and the bishop. So the king has to just go back somewhere, and we take the bishop. So now white has won a pawn, but black can't castle, and black has weak squares around his king. How much is this worth? Well, it's worth a lot more than a pawn. Look at Stockfish's number. He has white up by 3 pawns. So the fact that white is ahead in development, the fact that white has weak squares around the black king, and the fact that white's up a pawn all add up to more than 3 pawns. So here the fact that black can't castle is monstrously high. You know, his king is going to be caught in the middle, the white pieces are around him, there's weak squares. So the value of this is very, very high for white. It's not just winning a pawn here. He's also getting all these other advantages. Now let's compare that to the opening d6, d4, e5, this rare line where black says, white, would you like to trade queens? Pawn takes, queen takes, king takes. All right, well now in this opening, black can just play c6 and tuck his king into c7. So for instance here, if white plays like knight c3 and black plays c6, let's say white goes to castle, bishop e3, king c7, castle queenside. You know, I haven't made the best moves for white, but I'm just trying to show you. It looks like white has a tremendous advantage here. He's castled, black isn't. His rook is on the open file. His knight is on c3. His bishop's on e3. Black has no pieces out. You would think white has a tremendous advantage here, and if you say, well, not castling is worth a tremendous amount, and black can't castle here, look at Stockfish's evaluation. Even though white has 3 pieces out, he's ahead in development, he's castled, and black can't castle, and his king's moved a couple times. Stockfish actually says that black is better by 0.17. Well, that's pretty amazing, right? Why is black better here? Well, his pawn structure with the pawn on c6 keeping the knight out makes his king very safe and makes that knight fairly innocuous. And black has very nice places he can start putting his pieces. For instance, he could guard his e-pawn with a move like f6 and then develop his bishop out to b4, d6. The other bishop can go to e6. There's nothing that's going to stop black from bringing out all his pieces in the next few moves. So black here is in very good shape. Stockfish says his best move is knight f6. So this evaluation should amaze a lot of people. They should look at this and say, man, I learned that if your opponent can't castle and you have more pieces out, you're better. Well, in general, you're right, that you are going to be better. But here, black's king is in absolutely no danger. In the previous position, the queens were on the board. The squares around the king were really weak. White was ahead in development. Here, white's ahead in development, but he doesn't have any of those other advantages. And with the queens off the board, it makes a giant difference in how safe the king is when you can't castle. So you might say, oh, well, in this position, what does black have to gain by letting white trade queens here? It's just all bad and no good. Well, it's true, black doesn't get a lot of good out of it, but he doesn't get as much bad out of it as you might think. And let's say you're a player like someone I used to know who played here in the Philadelphia area, who loves to play endgames, and you don't mind if you can't castle if you're not in too much danger, but you love getting the queens off the board because you don't like playing complicated middle games with lots of queens, moving around, making all kinds of double attacks. Well, he actually used to play this opening and be very happy in this position. So, we can see that, maybe this isn't the best opening for black. Right now, Stockfish has white ahead by about a half a pawn. But if you like to play endgames like this, it's not so bad. And in fact, when grandmasters would play against a position like this, rather than trading queens and giving black that endgame, they'd rather transpose into the main line of the Philidor defense by playing knight f3 and keeping the tension in the position rather than trading queens. Okay, let's look at another one. How about passed pawns versus isolated pawns? Well, we know passed pawns are good and isolated pawns are bad, but suppose you do have a majority. Let's create a position here where white has 3 pawns against 2, and for the sake of argument, let's just make it even on the other side. If you saw my earlier video, king and 5 pawns against king and 4, you know that this is an easy win. So the question is, should white push up these pawns once he brings his king up and then create a passed pawn, because his passed pawn is going to become isolated? And we know isolated pawns are weak, and the answer is, well, of course, that's the way to win the game, is you're going to have to isolate your pawn to make it a passed pawn. If you say to yourself, well, passed pawns are good, but isolated pawns are bad, I don't know how to value those, so maybe I shouldn't create a passed pawn, then you're making the wrong evaluation, because the passed pawn is how you're going to win the game. So even though, let's say you play king d2, king d7, king d3, king d6, king d4, and now black simply waits, and now pawn up, and he puts the pawn in the way, and pawn up, and here. And let's say white plays here, pawn takes, king here, king here. Even though this pawn is isolated, it's the winning passed pawn. White's going to be able to win this game pretty easily. Black's going to get into Zugzwang pretty soon. So for instance, right now, if Black has to move the king, he'd have to go back and White's king could come up. But if he pushes pawns, let's say he plays a6 and White plays a3, just being symmetric, and Black plays g5 and White plays g4 and h6 and h3, and Black says, all right, now I'll move back. I'll go straight back, and White comes up here, pushes here, straight back, and White goes here, and Black goes here. And now White says, oh, on the way I'll pick up another pawn. King here, and obviously Black can't come up because White comes up in queen, so he goes straight back again. And now if White wants to, he could just run over here and pick up these 2 pawns and win the game. Or he could win by semi-stalemate. Let's show the semi-stalemate win, which we showed in the other video. You just go here and you force him to play here, and you take, and he goes here, and of course now you don't take because it's stalemate. You say, let's race, pawn here, doesn't matter which way he goes, whether he takes or not, and we'll get a rook over here, checkmate. So yes, it's true, if we get a passed pawn it'll be isolated, passed good, isolated bad, but here the good fantastically outweighs the bad, and the net result isn't 0, the net result is that passed pawn will win you the game. So today we've tried to talk about a lot of things that are, quote, bad in chess, like not being able to castle, or not trading when you're ahead, or trading when you're losing, which is probably even worse than not trading when you're ahead. We've talked about when double pawns are good and when they're bad. How much could we value them? Isolated pawns. All these things don't have numbers like the Reinfeld numbers. Pawns are 1 and bishops and knights are 3 and rooks are 5 and queens are 9. That's the beginner integer numbers that we use for evaluations. If you want to hear about a little bit more about those evaluations, you can see my earlier video called The Average Value of the Pieces is Not 1, 3, 3, 5, 9. But anyway, those things have numbers. But the other things that you learn in chess that are good and bad, like double pawns, passed pawns, outpost pieces, all kinds of different weak pawns like backward pawns, weak back ranks. All these things don't have numbers. But it really depends on the position, and you have to be careful because a lot of my students, they're so afraid of double pawns when I first get them. They're like, oh, I can't do this. I'll get a double pawn. For instance, let's do a position where that would be true. Let's do a con variation here. Knight here. a6, knight c3, bishop b4, bishop to, let's say, e2, bishop takes, pawn takes. All right, so White has doubled isolated pawns and an isolated a pawn. Does White have a bigger advantage than normal or a smaller advantage? Well, we already saw we didn't see in the Sicilian, but White's typical advantage would be less than like 0.4, more like 0.15 or 0.2. Let's ask Stockfish what the advantage is here for White with those doubled isolated pawns. Maybe Black's better. Stockfish says, oh, no. 1.4. That means if both sides play perfectly, White's already winning. Why is White winning when he has doubled isolated pawns on a semi-open file and an isolated a pawn? Well, you could see he's way ahead in development. He has 2 pieces out, Black has none. But White has the bishop pair, and even more importantly, all of Black's pawns on the queen side are on light squares, and White has a dark squared bishop that can go on those opposite colors. When all of your pawns are on light squares, the dark squares are weak. So that bishop is a monster here, enough to win the game for White. So in this position, you might evaluate this if you don't understand and say, well, okay, all these pawns are really weak, so maybe Black's better, but actually, White is way better here. All right, so we've tried to look at all these ideas in the video. If you liked the video, please hit the like button. If you haven't subscribed, you can do that. But the most important thing you can do is tell your chess friends about the channel, Dan Heisman Chess, and we'll get some other people that we can help. Thanks very much. We'll see you next time. Bye.